The wind bit hard behind the cafe, where Walter Granger sat on a crumpled piece of cardboard, cradling a paper cup of coffee, still warm from a stranger's kindness, when the back door slammed open. "I told you to get out of here," the manager barked, pointing his phone like a weapon. Walter didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just nodded, quietly gathered his faded duffel, and stood, knees stiff from the cold, pride even stiffer. Minutes later, a patrol car rolled up. The officer didn't shout. Just cuffed him. "Trespassing," they said. Again. But Walter said nothing. Not when they shoved him into the cruiser, not when they asked why he had no address. His silence wasn't guilt. It was something deeper. Days later, in a courtroom thick with judgment, everything changed. The judge stared down at this worn old man, then paused, and stood. What followed silenced the entire room, because some names, once spoken aloud, carry the weight of a nation. If you believe dignity doesn't expire with age or uniforms, stay with this story. Comment on her if you've ever felt invisible in a world moving too fast. And follow us if you still believe in stories where one man's quiet truth makes the whole room rise. Walter Granger was 71, though time had carved its own deeper truth into his posture. His spine slightly curved, his steps deliberate, measured like someone who'd learned to move without drawing attention. His beard, once coal-black, now fanned out in coarse waves of silver and rust, and his eyes, gray-blue and steady, held the quiet of someone who'd seen far more than he ever spoke aloud. Every morning, just before the sun crested the skyline, he'd rise from his corner behind the cafe on Millstone Street, fold his blanket with military precision, lace his boots tight, even if the soles had long since peeled, and walk 4 blocks east to where the dumpsters hadn't yet been emptied. Then he'd circle back, past the same cracked sidewalk, the graffiti-covered post office wall, the rusted hydrant on Sycamore, and 8th, flattening cans with the heel of his worn-out boot, collecting only those that didn't rattle with cigarette butts. He never begged, never asked, just moved like a shadow people chose not to notice. 17 years in uniform, 3 tours, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 shrapnel scar that still burned on rainy days. He'd led a squad through the thick of Najaf, dragged men out under fire, patched wounds with bare hands and prayer. But now, no one asked his name. Not the clerks at the corner store, not the barista who dumped hot water into yesterday's grounds, not the teenagers who laughed too loud when he passed. His coat, standard issue, 1984, still bore a faded name tag, the threads barely holding. He wore it like armor, though it no longer protected him from the cold or the silence. That morning, as he reached for a cup left by a stranger, a man in an apron cracked the cafe door just wide enough to hiss, "Not here again. I told you." Walter didn't answer. He just sipped quietly, as if the warmth might keep something deeper from freezing. The door slammed open with a metallic rattle, and the heat from the cafe spilled out for just a moment, along with the voice. "I told you already. You can't stay back here." The manager stepped into the alley, one hand gripping a trash bag, the other pointing a phone toward Walter like it was a badge. Walter didn't flinch. He simply raised the coffee cup a little higher and said quietly, "Just resting my legs. I'll be gone in a minute." The man scoffed, loud enough to draw attention from a passing couple who didn't stop walking. "A minute too long. You're scaring customers. We can't have people like you lurking back here. Go sit somewhere else. Or don't sit at all." Walter stood slowly, setting the cup down with care as if it were something sacred. His knees protested, stiff from hours against concrete, but he said nothing. He reached for his bag, old canvas, faded name patch, and began tying the flap shut with trembling fingers. "I don't want any trouble," he said. The manager was already on the phone. "Yeah, officer, I've got a trespasser behind the shop right now." "No, he's still here." Walter didn't wait to hear more. He walked, slow, deliberate steps, past the loading dock and down the narrow path between buildings. The coffee was still warm when he left it behind. By the time the squad car pulled up beside the alley, he was 2 blocks away, but knew the sound well enough to stop. The officer who got out was young, boots too clean, voice too firm for someone who hadn't yet seen what real fear looked like. "Sir," the cop said, "you've been reported for trespassing. Manager says this isn't your first time." Walter looked up, weary but calm. "Didn't break anything, didn't steal, just sat." "I understand," the officer replied, glancing at the notepad. "But we have prior complaints. I'll need you to come with me." Walter took a slow breath. "You need to take me?" "I'm afraid so." There was no handcuff struggle, no raised voice. Walter simply nodded, lifted the strap of his bag across his shoulder, and stepped toward the cruiser. People passed by on the sidewalk, 2 teenagers on bikes, a woman walking a dog, but none looked twice. The old man in the back of a police car wasn't new to this street. He was just part of the background now. At the precinct, they fingerprinted him like a stranger, asked for an address he didn't have, a phone number he never owned. "You've been processed before," the desk officer muttered, looking at the record. "Court date's printed here. Don't miss it." Walter took the paper with hands that had once gripped the frame of a wounded soldier under fire, and stared at it like it was written in another language. He left the station with the same quiet dignity Hyde walked in with. No fight, no plea, only silence. The sky was darker now, a hazy kind of gray that sat heavy over the city like it knew something the people didn't. He looked up, exhaled through his nose, and kept walking. But someone had been watching. A pair of eyes across the street. A phone lowering slowly. A face not unfamiliar to Walter. Just a nod, barely more than a shift in the wind. But it was enough. Because the last time someone nodded like that, Walter had pulled 3 men out of a kill zone and walked 28 miles through desert heat to find a way home. And this time, someone else was about to return the favor. The courtroom was colder than it needed to be, walls a dull beige, benches scuffed and worn, the air filled with the low buzz of whispers and impatient shuffling. Walter Granger stood in the middle of it all, shoulders squared beneath a coat that had seen more years than most men in the room. His canvas bag rested at his feet, frayed, loyal, silent. The judge, a woman with gray hair pinned tight and glasses perched low on her nose, flipped through the file like she'd seen this story before. And maybe she had. Just not this version. "Walter Granger," she said, her voice clipped but not unkind. "You're being charged with trespassing on private property. According to the report, you refused to leave the cafe's rear premises when asked. Is that accurate?" Walter's voice was low, steady. "No, ma'am. I was leaving. He called the police before I could step off the curb." She paused, looked up. "You don't have a permanent address?" Walter shook his head once. "No, ma'am." Before she could continue, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, not fast, not loud, but enough to fracture the murmur like glass cracking under weight. Heads turned. Even the bailiff glanced up. A man stepped inside. His presence didn't ask for attention. It commanded it. He moved down the aisle with the unhurried certainty of someone who'd walked through enemy fire and didn't flinch anymore. Tall, broad-shouldered, uniform pressed crisp, boots landing with the soft thud of discipline. His hair was military short, his jaw locked tight. Every movement was precise, unbothered. His name wasn't spoken, but the energy in the room bent slightly in his direction, like the air recognized him, even if the people didn't. He took a seat in the front row, said nothing, just looked straight ahead, at Walter. And in that single look, there was no pity, only memory, recognition. The judge noticed. The clerk paused mid-typing. Even the cafe manager, seated 2 rows behind, shifted in his chair like the seat had grown hotter. Walter didn't turn to see who it was. He didn't have to. His eyes blinked slower. His breath changed. Whatever weight he'd been carrying in silence now had a second shadow behind it. The judge cleared her throat, tried to continue reading from the folder, but stumbled slightly, just enough to betray the shift in atmosphere. The man leaned forward slightly. His hands rested on his knees. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Ma'am," he said evenly. "Permission to speak." It wasn't a question. Not really. The room stilled once more. The judge raised her eyes, studied him. There was something in her stare. Something pulled between protocol and the pulse quickening at her wrist. Walter finally turned his head, just enough to meet the man's eyes. He didn't smile, but his posture straightened almost imperceptibly. For the first time that morning he looked seen. And no one needed an introduction. Everyone knew what came next. The judge's voice faltered slightly, her fingers hesitating on the folder, but she didn't look up right away. The silence stretched, tense, deliberate, unyielding. Then she spoke, quiet but firm. "State your name for the record." The man in uniform stood. The scrape of the wooden bench against tile echoed like a gunshot in the still room. "Colonel Matthew Granger," he said, his voice even clipped. "United States Army." The cafe manager, seated near the back, let out a breathy laugh. Just loud enough. "Oh, great," he muttered, gesturing with an open palm. "Of course. Another soldier to cry for the old bum. What's next, a parade?" Colonel Granger turned, but didn't advance. He didn't need to. His gaze was surgical. Clean, cold, controlled. The courtroom fell into a hush so deep it felt physical, like the walls themselves leaned in to listen. "I watched the footage," Matthew said, his voice low, carrying like steel pulled slow from its sheath. "From the alley. From the security camera your staff didn't know was still operational." The manager blinked, his mouth half open. "You approached my father first. You raised your voice. You threatened police before he stood. And you made sure to dump the trash bag beside him, on purpose." The manager's smirk faded half an inch, enough to betray something shifting behind the eyes. "That's not—" Matthew didn't interrupt with volume. He just reached into his jacket, pulled out a single printed still, grainy, time-stamped, unmistakable. In it, the manager loomed over Walter, hand mid-gesture, lips twisted. He placed the image gently on the prosecution's table. The judge didn't say a word. Neither did the prosecutor. The paper spoke louder than any objection ever could. "No one here asked you to like him," Matthew continued. "But you don't get to strip dignity because you assume no one's watching." The manager crossed his arms, tried to scoff, but no sound came. He looked around the room, at the clerk, at the officer by the door, at the strangers who now stared not at Walter, but at him. And not with curiosity, no, with something colder. A kind of quiet verdict. Colonel Granger stepped back without another word. The judge, still silent, hadn't moved. The entire room had become a breath held too long. And the man who once laughed now looked like he couldn't find his breath at all. The image sat on the table like a verdict. Silent, undeniable, framed in time-stamped ink. No one spoke. No one needed to. The judge stared at it, her jaw tightening, breath slow. The manager, who just moments ago leaned back like the room belonged to him, now shifted forward, eyes darting from the photograph to the man in uniform, to the face of Walter Granger, stone-readable, but suddenly, unmistakably, present. Colonel Matthew Granger didn't move again. He didn't need to. The truth had already been loaded into the chamber, and silence had pulled the trigger. "I'd like the court to acknowledge," he said, voice low and deliberate, "that this wasn't an arrest. This was a humiliation." The prosecutor didn't object. Neither did the defense. The room had lost the air of routine proceeding. This wasn't a case anymore. It was a reckoning. The judge turned toward the cafe manager. "Mr. Lowell," she said, her voice now sharp enough to slice glass. "Do you deny this photograph represents what happened?" Lowell blinked, swallowed. I mean, maybe the angle's bad. I didn't dump anything on him." "That's not." "Then why was the bag split open beside his feet?" the judge asked. Lowell's voice cracked. "Look, he's always there. I was just trying to—" "To what?" she snapped, leaning forward. "Make a point? Prove your dominance over a man with nowhere else to sit." Lowell opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes dropped. The silence returned, thicker now, the kind that coils in the gut. Even the clerk paused mid-keystroke. A man in the back, someone who'd chuckled when Walter was first brought in, looked down at his shoes. The room had shifted again, but this time not around Matthew Granger, around Walter, because no one was laughing anymore. The bailiff stepped forward quietly, hands behind his back, standing near Lowell. Not in threat, but in protocol. Still, it was enough. Lowell's shoulders stiffened. His mouth opened, like he might protest again. But all that came was a whisper no one could hear. "I didn't know," someone said near the rear, soft, cracking like paper. A woman in a gray coat, hands clasped tight in her lap. "We all just walked past him." No one answered. The shame was too loud. The judge lifted the photograph once more, held it in her hand like it weighed something more than paper. "This court finds no grounds for criminal trespassing," she declared. In fact, what this man needed was not prosecution. It was protection. Lowell shifted in his seat. His lips moved, but the words never reached the air. The bailiff leaned closer. A moment later, Lowell stood, hands barely resisting, as the officer took his elbow. No cuffs, no words, just a walk across the courtroom, head lowered, not by force, but by something heavier. And Walter? He didn't even look. He simply picked up his bag and waited for the silence to finish speaking. When the judge's gavel finally struck the bench, it didn't sound like justice. It sounded like silence, clean, final, absolute. Walter didn't move. His hands remained at his sides, bag by his foot, back straight not from pride, but from the kind of posture that years of orders, of carrying the weight of others, never quite lets go of. He didn't look at the cafe manager as the man was escorted out. Didn't glance at the people who had once turned away. He simply stood in the middle of that courtroom like a monument too weathered to crumble. It was someone in the back row, a teenager, no older than 20, who rose first. His voice cracked through the hush. "I'm sorry, sir." Just that. Nothing more. He didn't wait for a response. He sat back down, but something in the room had shifted. A woman with graying hair dabbed her eyes with a tissue, then walked quietly down the aisle and placed a sealed envelope beside Walter's bag. A few bills poked from the edge. No one said what they were for, and she didn't explain. Near the wall, a waitress Walter had seen but never spoken to stepped forward, reached into her coat and held out a paper cup. It was steaming, fresh. "You take cream?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter looked at her, not surprised, not suspicious, just still. "No," he said gently. "Black's fine." She nodded and left the cup in his hand. Another man, tall, maybe a contractor, rough palms and heavy boots, approached next. He didn't speak, just extended a hand. And when Walter hesitated, the man didn't flinch. Eventually, their palms met. One firm, one cracked and calloused. No words passed between them. They didn't need to. All around the room, people began to lower their heads, not in shame, not entirely, but in acknowledgement. Like a town suddenly remembering the name it had tried to forget. Walter looked toward the flag behind the judge's bench. The same flag he'd saluted under desert sun, beneath enemy fire, above makeshift tents soaked in monsoon rain. It hadn't changed, but maybe they had. "I never needed much," Walter said finally, voice low, shaped by gravel and fire. "Just to not be forgotten." Nobody replied. They didn't have to. The silence was enough. Outside the courthouse, the sky had softened, gray still, but lighter. People didn't rush off. They lingered. A mother helped her child down the steps, then turned back to glance at Walter through the door's glass. He didn't wave, just nodded. And in that nod was something unspoken. This place used to feel like home. Maybe it could be again. It started with a photograph, printed in matte black and white, framed in simple oak, and hung on the back wall of the same cafe where Walter Granger once drank a gifted cup of lukewarm coffee in silence. In the image he's not posing, just standing. A moment captured as he looked down the street, coat buttoned to his neck, duffel bag slung over one shoulder. But in that stillness was something undeniable. Steadiness. Dignity. Next to the frame, someone had mounted a small brass plaque. It didn't say much, just his name, his rank, his years of service, and the words, "He sat here once. We will not forget again." No ribbon cutting. No press release. The owner of the cafe didn't even say anything about it. But each morning, the photo caught the morning sun just right, like even the light had decided to acknowledge him. Soon after, a group of local veterans donated a glass case near the front entrance. Inside, an old set of boots, a folded flag, a printout of the court transcript, and at the very bottom, Walter's original service photo in uniform. Eyes younger, sharper, but somehow still the same. The changes weren't loud. They weren't official. They simply happened. A boy from the high school started a podcast episode about the trial. Not for views, just because he said the story felt like it belonged in history class. A girl from the art school painted Walter's silhouette walking down Millstone Street, jacket loose, dried even. They hung it in the town library. And then there were the letters. Dozens of them. Some typed, most handwritten. From strangers. From neighbors. From kids who'd seen his face and asked their parents who he was. Walter never answered them. He didn't need to. His silence did more than 1,000 speeches could. People began sitting longer in that cafe. Not because the coffee changed, but because the energy did. The man who was once asked to leave now lived in the air there. On the walls, in the glances people exchanged before they spoke too loud or too fast. Even the teenagers shifted. A group who once smirked as they passed him on the street now walked with eyes level, shoulders back, not in fear, but in respect. Sometimes they stopped, asked questions. Sometimes they didn't ask anything at all, just sat near him on the same bench in the square, in quiet solidarity. Walter rarely said much, but when he did, the words came slow, like pages turned carefully. One boy once asked him what it felt like, being seen again. Walter looked at him, then at the flag gently moving in the breeze above the courthouse roof. He didn't answer with words, just nodded once. Small. Final. Tough. Enough. And on that bench, beneath that flag, his presence stayed like an echo. Not loud, not fleeting, but carved into the rhythm of the town. In the quiet corner of a cafe that used to ignore him, Walter Granger sat with both hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. Across from him, Colonel Matthew Granger stirred his own drink with slow, absent movements. The spoon tapped gently against the porcelain. Rhythmic, soft, like the tick of a memory trying to find its place. No one disturbed them. The waitress, recognizing the silence between them as something sacred, left their table untouched. The light from the window slanted gold across the floor, catching the edge of Walter's boots and the sleeve of his son's uniform. For a while, neither of them spoke. The world outside moved on. Traffic whispered by, a dog barked down the block, but inside, Time held its breath. Then Matthew finally asked, his voice low but steady. "You okay, old man?" Walter smiled. Not wide, not immediate. Just a crease at the corner of his mouth that hadn't moved in years. "Didn't think I'd need to be," he replied, eyes still fixed on the rising steam of his cup. Another beat passed. Then Matthew reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something folded in cloth. He placed it on the table gently, like setting down a memory too heavy for words. Walter looked, then slowly unwrapped the faded triangle of fabric. It was his old patrol cap, worn, sun-bleached, a small tear near the stitching. Matthew didn't say anything. He just nodded once, and Walter, after a long pause, nodded back. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of warm bread and fresh soil. Inside, the cafe's old jukebox crackled to life with a song neither man had heard in decades. A slow tune, country maybe, or blues. Something with steel strings and heartache built in. Walter placed the cap beside his cup, then leaned back in his chair. His son leaned too, elbows on knees, staring at the same point beyond the window pane. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't closure. It was something smaller, and maybe deeper. The way a quiet room can carry more truth than a courtroom ever could. The only movement came when Matthew reached across the table and tapped his father's knuckles. Once. No words followed. None were needed. They sat that way until the light dimmed and the cafe's bulbs flickered on with a soft click. No one asked them to leave. No one broke the silence. It felt like even the walls understood this wasn't just coffee. It was time folding back in on itself. When they finally rose, it was at the same moment. Chairs pushed in. Walter picked up his cap. Matthew reached for the door. As they stepped out into the soft evening, two shadows moved in unison down the sidewalk. One slow, one steady, but never out of step again. A week after the courtroom fell silent, Frank Granger's name was already echoing in places he had never set foot. It began at a public high school on the edge of town. A history teacher, normally strict, rarely sentimental, paused mid-lesson, pulled out his phone and played a clip from the news. Walter's voice, faint and cracked, filled the room as he spoke of silence, service, and being forgotten. No one laughed. No one shuffled. Even the boy in the back row, usually half asleep, sat upright. By the end of class, two students had quietly walked to the flagpole out front and resecured the rope that had come loose the week before. Neither said why. They didn't have to. At the town library, a woman in her 60s pinned a printed article to the community board. A copy of the story titled "The Forgotten Hero." Next to it, she taped a sticky note in shaky handwriting. Read this: "We owe him more than silence." It stayed there for weeks, curling at the corners, never removed. Frank, meanwhile, said nothing. He returned to the bench in the park near the church. Same coat. Same folded hand. He sat most mornings without a watch, without a paper, just the rising sun and passing time. But people began stopping, not all at once, and not to stare. Just a nod. A cup of coffee left beside him. A father whispering to his son, "That's him." In the barber shop, someone framed a copy of the front page with Frank's photo and placed it beside a dusty picture of the town's founding mayor. The barber said nothing. He just cleaned the glass more often. The diner he had once been chased from changed its hours. Quietly. It now opened an hour earlier, and the first booth by the window was always empty, waiting. Nobody sat there. Not out of fear, but respect. Teenagers who used to cross the street when they saw an old man now held doors open, nodded first, even offered to carry groceries without being asked. The change was small, but it rippled. One young Marine home on leave told his recruiter, "That guy? He made me want to serve for the right reasons." Frank never spoke about the trial again, but his son did. Colonel Granger visited local schools, not to lecture but to listen. And when asked about his father, he'd simply say, "He taught me everything without a word." More stories surfaced. An EM2 who once treated Frank after a fall and never forgot the way he refused a stretcher, insisting someone else might need it more. A shop clerk who remembered a winter when Frank left $5 on the counter, took nothing, and walked out. No plaque called him a saint. No statue bore his name. But when someone said, "Frank," heads turned, hearts slowed, and conversations paused. One evening, a boy in a hoodie stood outside the courthouse steps, staring at the American flag, rising slow against a lavender sky. In his hand was a copy of the article, folded so many times it was soft as cloth. He didn't speak, just stood, looking up. And in that quiet, like a breeze through tall grass or the faint echo of boots in a hallway long since empty, the legacy of Frank Granger kept moving forward, one heartbeat at a time. On the day Walter Granger stood in the East Room of the White House, everything was still. Not silent, but still. Like the world held its breath. He wore a new suit, dark blue, tailored modestly, with shoes that still felt stiff from the box. His hands, scarred, calloused, trembling, rose slowly as the president approached, holding the replacement Medal of Honor. The cameras clicked once, then stopped. The medal was placed gently around his neck, and for a long second, Walter didn't move. Then, he looked up. His eyes didn't seek the crowd, or the generals, or even his son standing tall in uniform. He looked instead at the flag behind the podium, folds catching the light like waves holding a secret. "I never asked for this," he said, his voice low, gravel thick. "But thank you for seeing me." And then he added, quieter still, "for not letting me disappear." No one applauded. Not yet. The moment was too full. The medal against his chest barely moved. But something shifted in the room, a weight lifting, a silence healing. A few minutes later, as Walter stepped outside into the open air, the wind caught the edge of the flag above the White House. It flapped once, slow and steady, as if saluting back. And behind him, inside that great hall, his photo was quietly placed in a frame. No title, no plaque, just the name Walter Granger. They say some heroes march, some stand tall, but the rarest ones, like Walter, teach us to rise, simply by refusing to fall. If you believe in honoring those who never asked for thanks but gave everything anyway, leave a comment with one word: dignity. And if these stories still matter to you, join us. Subscribe. We tell them for the ones who never told theirs.